Greetings, Lorcana fans. Into the Inklands is finally here, and with it, 2 brand new starter decks. But how do these starter decks work? What's inside them? And how can you best use them to win your first Into the Inklands sealed event?
Today, we're diving into the new Amber Emerald starter deck, known as Dogged and Dynamic. Let's check out how it works.
The Dogged and Dynamic starter deck is designed to introduce players to Into the Inklands with a variety of cards and some brand new locations.
It's a perfect starting point for new players, and it introduces some cool new mechanics to seasoned players.
Now, this deck is designed to introduce you to a variety of new cards, with 28 total, so there's lots of 1-ofs and 2-ofs, therefore it's not the most consistent, forcing you to adapt to each and every game you play depending on what you draw.
At its core, the strategy of this deck is to go wide, with a lot of card draw options giving you an opportunity to overwhelm your opponent with characters on the board.
This deck's breakdown really reflects this strategy, with 48 of the 60 cards being characters. And then there are 7 actions which all allow you to draw cards to find more characters, and then there are 5 locations.
So how should you play this deck in order to give yourself the best opportunity for victory? Let's take a look at the cards.
At 1 ink, you have a few different options. 2 of them are characters. Kita is 1, she's a standard 2/2 with 1 lore. Or the more interesting option is Pluto, who allows you to ramp. That is, he allows you to play other characters for cheaper. So playing him on turn 1 allows you to play a 3-cost character on turn 2, and we'll talk more about that later.
Your other option is to play locations. You have 5 copies, all costing 1, between Neverland, Mermaid Lagoon, and Deville Manor. These locations allow you to start gaining lore right away. Just as a reminder, locations allow you to gain lore at the start of every turn, no questing needed.
These locations are a great option on turn 1 if you're not doing the Pluto ramp play or not building towards a lucky combo. And there's a reason that we like them a little bit better than Kita, and I'll talk about that a little bit later.
At 2 ink, you have 3 options. Wendy, the more aggressive play with her 2 lore, or you could play one of the puppies with 1 less lore but 1 more strength.
Your third option is Helga. There's only 1 of her in this deck, but she's an interesting play. She's a 2/1 in Quest for 1 lore, but when she's challenged and banished, she banishes the challenging character. So you can put her on the board early and use her to gain some lore, and if your opponent wants to remove her, their character will be removed in turn.
On turn 3, your options are plentiful. And in fact, if you look at the deck's curve, it is heavily weighted towards turn 3 and earlier.
There are 8 cards you can play at 3 ink. In my opinion, one of the most fun and best in the early game is Kit Cloudkicker, which allows you to send a character back to your opponent's hand when he's played, giving you some momentum and allowing you to maintain some board control.
Jasper is a card from the first set, and with his ability to interrupt your opponent's questing and his 4 willpower on turn 3, he's a great defensive play.
Yeah, I love this play. Rolly, I think, is another great play. We often overlook the support ability, but it can do a lot of work buffing your smaller characters, so getting him on the board gives your lower strength characters a little bit of extra punch to control the board.
For a more aggressive strategy, Jetsam is the only turn 3 character with 2 lore, but with only 2 willpower, he does go down easily.
Wildcat is another fun play on turn 3. Because he has evasive, he's difficult to remove, and so you can probably quest with him a few times before your opponent manages to get him off the board. And as a bonus, he can take out items. And then you have Horse from the first chapter, who's a 4/3. He's fine.
Flotsam is strong on the challenge, but he does go down easy. And although Flotsam and Jetsam do kind of buff each other like they did in the first chapter, it's not as strong as the original pairing, so with only 2 of each of them in this deck, I wouldn't count on this combo.
Now let's talk Pongo. Pongo is a great card that you can play on turn 3 as he only costs 3 ink, but I would argue he's not an ideal turn 3 play. What you really want to do with Pongo is use him to draw cards, and he goes down kind of easily, so you really want to put him out when you can actually use him. His ability allows you to look at the top card of your deck, and if it's a character card, you can draw that card. But here's the thing, it costs 2 ink, and you can use it once per turn. I would argue that the better play for him is to wait until turn 5, because you don't need to exert him to use this ability. So you can play him on turn 3, and then use 2 ink to look at the top card of your deck right away, so that he can replace himself. You really want to play Pongo when you have the ink to use him if you can.
At 4 ink, you have 5 options.
The ones you'll see most often are Cubby and Patch, because there's 3 copies of each. And these cards are fine, their stats are fine, but what they really allow you to do is make better use of your lower cost characters by manipulating both your character strength and the strength of your opponent's character. So don't overlook their ability to help you control the board mid-game if you need to.
Tinkerbell is a much better turn 4 option, as she allows you to grab a character of your choice from the top 4 cards in your deck.
And this really enables you to keep going wide, as it were. Now let's talk about Peter Pan. He's an interesting character, and there's 1 of him in this deck. Peter Pan allows you to gain a little extra lore by moving to locations. When he moves to a location, you get lore equal to that location's lore. So if you have a location in play and a little extra ink during your turn, you can pick up some bonus lore. Now, I would argue that most turns you're going to be trying to maximize your ink to get as many characters on the board as possible, and so you won't necessarily have an extra ink free every turn, and so this setup may not always pay off. But here's what you need to know about this card. This card is the only card in this deck that lets you gain lore on your turn without your opponent being able to respond. And by that I mean, if you have a location in play, or if you play a location, you can immediately use Peter Pan to gain lore. So if you're in a scenario where you are 1 or 2 lore away from winning and you're trying to really close out the game and your opponent has a big board state, you can be drawing towards Peter Pan to help you win the game. That's the one thing I want you to remember about this card.
But now let's talk about Lucky. Lucky is crazy good in this deck. He can perform 2 functions. First, he can serve as your finisher. If you have 4 other characters in play, he gives all of them +1 lore as he quests.
Math, 4 characters, 1 lore each, plus Lucky's lore is 1 + 4 lore. That's 9 lore in a turn if you set it up properly.
That's bonkers good.
9 lore. But let's say you have Lucky and you don't have 4 characters in play, so you haven't quite set up this combo. Lucky allows you to search for other puppies or characters cost 2 or less. You can exert him to look at the top 3 cards of your deck and put each character cost 2 or less into your hand, so you can get 3 cards in a single turn.
From a flavor perspective, let's hope they're puppies.
Anyway, Lucky's just great.
You have some really great options on turn 5. Probably the best of them is Nani. She's a fantastic bodyguard with a 3/6 stat line. Because this deck is full of smaller characters, enabling Nani's bodyguard allows your characters to stick around longer, enabling your go wide strategy.
And then you have Don Carnage. He's one of your finishers. For 5 ink, he's a 4/4 that quests for 2 lore, but importantly, he's evasive. So once you gather up a bit of lore, he's a great closer, getting 2, 4, 6 lore before your opponent can effectively deal with him.
At 6 ink, you have just 1 card. Literally 1.
And it's Robin Hood, who quests for 4 lore. He's another one of your finishers. If you can get close to ending the game, you drop him on the board and your opponent has to respond because he's questing for 4 every turn.
It's a really good thing the art's so good on that one.
I agree. Now at the top end, you have 2 cards at 7 ink, the most expensive cards in this deck, and they're both pretty good on the board, Starkey and Pluto. Pluto being a 3/8 bodyguard, and if you get him on the board, he's just fantastic. But here's the thing, 7 ink is a lot for this deck. Every character that you put in the inkwell in order to get to 7 ink is 1 less that you have on the board. So I would argue that you probably shouldn't be playing these cards too often, although the situation may arise. Now, here's the thing, Pluto is fantastic if you get him on the board, and if you can shift him out for 5, it's just great. At 3/8 and with his healing ability, he probably will stick around for a long time, and again will enable your go wide strategy. But don't play 2 or 3 ink just so you can get this card on the board. Better to ink him and try to go wide. But again, if you can shift him out on turn 5, that's just fantastic.
Okay, so let's talk about the actions. You have 3 in this deck. 2 of them are actually from Rise of the Floodborn. The first is Improvise. It gives you a small strength bonus, but really don't be afraid to use this for its card draw alone.
And then you have Hypnotize, which forces your opponent to discard a card and lets you draw a card. And I think it's a bit clunky in this deck, honestly. I think if you're in a scenario where you have a choice between playing Hypnotize and playing a character, most of the time you're going to want to play a character, again, to enable this deck's go-wide strategy. Now, if your opponent's sitting with 1 or 2 cards in hand and you think one of them is a combo piece or very important, go ahead and use it, but don't be afraid to ink this card in order to get a character on the board.
Lastly is Strike a Match, which is a new song, and it's just good. Any song that allows you to draw cards or maybe even filter your hand is great.
For your overall strategy, I'd argue that this deck is pretty straightforward. Now we're going to talk about some combos and some lines of play in a moment, but I'd argue that what this deck is generally trying to do is drop a character or location on board every single turn you can, and then by the mid game you want to drop 2 or 3 characters on the board every turn, using different characters and card draw to enable you to refill your hand. If you can, drop a bodyguard on turn 5 to protect your characters, and then when you get to the end game, drop Robin Hood or Don Carnage to allow you to push yourself over the edge to get that 20 lore.
For your ink strategy, you're going to want to carefully consider what cards you're inking. Every character you ink is actually 1 less that you're able to play. Therefore, you might want to consider maxing out your ink at 5 or 6. This gives you enough ink to play cards like Robin Hood or to play multiple low-cost characters within 1 turn while drawing extra cards using Lucky or Pongo.
Yeah, there's really no reason to push this to 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 ink most games.
Let's talk about 3 opening options or lines of play for your first few turns.
And the first is the Lucky combo. If you draw Lucky in your opening hand, you can set up a 7 to 9 lore quest on turn 5 by doing the following. On turns 1 through 3, you play characters, not locations. On turn 4, you play Lucky, and on turn 5, you play another character, or ideally Nani, who can serve as a bodyguard for your smaller characters. At that point, you can quest for 7 lore. Or, if you happen to drop Wendy on turn 2, or Jetsam on turn 3, you can quest for 9 lore. With a bodyguard in place, you can close out the game pretty quickly. So if you draw Lucky, that's something to look out for. Now, the key to this line of play is leaving your early characters ready and not exerted, so they can't be challenged. If your opponent manages to banish one of your turn 1 through 3 characters, then this line of play won't work, and you'll have to take another turn setting it up.
The second option is aggro play, getting a ton of lore really fast. Here's how you do it. Turn 1, drop a location. Turn 2, Wendy with her 2 lore. Turn 3, Jetsam with his 2 lore, or Wildcat with his evasive. After getting this lore lead, just continue to drop a ton of characters on the board until you force your opponent to react.
The next line of play is your ramp play, and by this I mean getting bigger characters on the board faster. You do this by playing Pluto on turn 1, who can reduce the cost of other characters. The only problem is, Pluto becomes vulnerable, so ideally, you're ramping into Kit Cloudkicker on turn 2. This allows you to remove a threat from your opponent's board, protecting Pluto and maybe allowing you to use him another turn. Pluto into Kit is a fantastic 1-2 turn combo, especially on the play.
Okay, let's talk about your Mulligan strategy. In our opinion, here's what you're looking for. You definitely want to have a character or location for your 1, 2, and 3 turn plays. Because this deck wants to go wide, it's really important that you develop your momentum early.
Now for turn 1, if you're going to ramp, keep Pluto. If you're going to play the Lucky strategy, obviously you need a character on turn 1. Otherwise, I would argue that playing a location is best rather than playing Kita, and I'll tell you why in a moment.
Now, there are only 6 uninkable cards in this deck, so ink shouldn't really be a worry, but if you end up with several in your hand, we recommend that you only keep 2.
Anything cost 5 or above, I'm generally sending away, except for perhaps a turn 5 Nani, because she's just really good. And if you have Pluto to play her on turn 4, she's even better.
There are several cards that you will want to keep 100% of the time. Always keep Lucky. And always keep Strike a Match. It's a great song that you can sing on turn 3 to draw extra cards.
There's something else I want you to consider with the Mulligan in this deck. There are several cards in this deck that allow you to draw characters, but only characters. With 48 characters in this deck, that leaves 12 that are misses. So every one of those cards that you have in your opening hand is one less miss in your deck for those cards that draw characters. And this takes me back to the Kita versus location play that we mentioned earlier on turn 1. Kita is a card that you can draw with several different cards in your deck, including Lucky, who allows you to keep 2 cost or less characters. Locations, you cannot keep. Therefore, sending Kita back to your deck is one more card that you can draw with these other character drawing cards, and the location is not. Again, it's something to think about with this deck. The more characters that are in your deck instead of actions and locations, the more options you have with your character card draw cards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whew, that was a lot.
I hope you all got all that. At the end of the day, what you're trying to do is play a lot of characters, draw a lot of characters, and be very efficient with your ink.
I know I'm super excited to check out this starter deck.
Puppies!
Yay into the Inklands. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.
Sign off catchphrase.